If you think the United States can do better than the far-right authoritarian policies of MAGA Republicans, this channel is for you. If you think we can build an economy that works for the 99% of Americans rather than the wealthiest top 1%, this channel is for you. If you think real freedom means respecting the civil rights and civil liberties of others, not telling people what books they can read and who they can love, this channel is for you. If you think we should live in a civilized world based on international law and not might makes right, that human rights are universal and should be the guiding principle of foreign policy, this channel is for you. Welcome to America 2112, where a better future is discussed daily. In this video, I'm going to give you a little background about how this channel came to be and what path I followed and evolved in my political views. I used to be a right-winger, and as you can see, that is the Wayback Machine archive of the Unskewed Polls website that I created back in 2012. Now, before we get to 2012, I'm going to go back to the 80s and tell you a little bit about where I came from and how I initially became a right-winger and where I went from there. I was largely apolitical when I was in high school. When I got to college initially, I started moving towards the left. In my first 2 years of college, I was definitely left of center, and by my sophomore year in college, I would say I was becoming pretty progressive, especially in economic issues. And I think you could say that I didn't use the term at the time or was familiar with it, but I think you could say my political views were in line with democratic socialism when I was a sophomore in college. Now, for junior year in college, I transferred to the University of Massachusetts, a campus that was very much on the left in its campus politics. And I kind of viewed myself as being somewhat moderate at that point, maybe in reaction to the politics on the left. And in getting involved in campus politics, I met people on the left and the right, and I found that the people on the right were a bit more welcoming and welcomed me in, even if they didn't think I agreed with all of their views. Some of the people on the left on campus then seemed to not be as welcoming. I think maybe it just they weren't as effective at doing outreach as maybe they could have or should have been, because had they welcomed me in, I'm not blaming them, but had they welcomed me in, they probably could have persuaded me to move more to the left on some issues and be more in line with them. But the people on the right of center side did that, and I think I felt at home with those people and found friends among them, and they convinced me to rethink some views on some issues. And I gradually started moving toward the right, and at one point I started to believe, and looking back on it now, I started to drink the Kool-Aid. I started to believe that both economically and socially conservative views and policies were better for most of the people, would be better for the country. I now realize I was wrong, but we'll get to that later. So by 1988, I considered myself right of center and identified as a Republican rather than a Democrat, and voted for Republicans in the 1988 election, including for George Bush Sr. By 92, I started getting a bit disillusioned with Republicans not standing up for a lot of what they campaign on, what they believe in or claim to believe in, and I started drifting toward the more right of center faction of the Libertarian Party, and I even voted Libertarian in the 92 presidential election. And by the end of the 2000s, I kind of got out of that phase, went back to being a Republican rather than being a Libertarian, and through most of the 2000s stayed on that side of things. And by 2012, I started writing articles and doing websites related to politics, including what you see on the screen now. Now, some years after that, I would start to question whether I really still believed in some of the conservative views on both social issues and economic issues. And when I began to realize that the idea that everyone should pull themselves up by the bootstraps is not really working in our current society, where both wealth and income is distributed so unequally that it's not possible for everyone to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And I began to realize and understand what leads to policies that make that happen. I began to realize that, one, supply-side economics doesn't work, or as people on the left call it, trickle-down. That doesn't work. I began to realize that the policies that Republicans have been pushing for and conservatives for generations do not create an economy that's more conducive to most people being able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and be economically self-sufficient. I realized that we need to look for other policies, and I began to seriously question whether or not I supported the economic agendas of the conservative movement and Republican politics. And by 2018, 2019, I started considering myself not so much conservative. I still identified as a Republican, not a Democrat, because I'm still drinking some of the right-wing Kool-Aid about, that the Democrats are trying to destroy the country and all of this. But I seriously began to question whether or not I was really on the right anymore. But I couldn't necessarily view myself as being left of center either. So by the end of 2020, I viewed myself as politically homeless. I couldn't identify with a lot of conservative economic policies anymore. And then what happened after that, of course, we had the 2020 election, which Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, and then he refused to accept that he lost. And of course, he did the fake electors and the insurrection and storming the Capitol by his supporters on January 6th. And I realized I'm definitely not one of these people. I don't support this. I'm not on the right. I don't think that the election was rigged and stolen. Donald Trump lost the election fair and square. Joe Biden won the election. It was a free and fair election, and it was time for Trump to step down, and he was looking like he was not going to do that. And he tried to stay in power. He tried to re-rig the election through the fake electors and tried to do the challenge to the election results on January 6th before they stormed the Capitol. And then he incited that, and he sat in the White House watching on a TV and doing nothing for 187 minutes, as was exposed by the January 6th committee. And I realized at that point I considered myself politically independent. I was definitely not a Republican. I was definitely not a Trump supporter. And I was definitely a never Trumper. And I realized that ever having supported Trump in the past was a mistake. The millions who voted for him, it was a mistake, should not have done so. And I resolved that I would never support. And as long as the Republicans who passed by an official RNC resolution, they referred to January 6th as legitimate political discourse and basically owned the insurrection, I decided I could never again vote for another Republican as long as they're insurrectionists, election deniers, and supporters of the January 6th insurrection and the continued whitewashing, lying, and gaslighting about what happened on January 6th that Republicans still engage in to this day. Over time and continue to rethink issues, I definitely moved more to the left, especially on economic issues, but a lot of other issues as well. So I've come to believe that capitalism is not the solution. Capitalism in a perfect world might work, but we don't live in a perfect world. Communism might work in a perfect world either, but that doesn't work either. We find that most modern industrial civilized societies use a mixed economy where the private sector very regulated to make sure it doesn't pollute the environment and abuse workers and rip off the customers through scams and unethical practices and whatnot. That we have a mixed economy with the free market providing those goods and services it can best provide, and the government, through providing public services, provides public services, provides those needs that can be better met done through the public sector rather than through the private sector. So you find in most European countries and here in the United States, we have largely mixed economy. It's not a pure capitalist economy. It's not even a mostly capitalist economy, but a system of a regulated, supposed to be free market, because when you have major industries buy up all the market share and you have 2 or 3 companies providing all the services and monopolizing the situations, that's not really a free market when there isn't competition, because in theory a free market system works when customers have choice and there's competition, and that's what drives prices down and drives up the cost of drives up the quality of services. So that is, and I've also moved more to the left on social issues, more on personal freedom issues, and I've moved away from having been somewhat socially conservative on issues, and now I believe that individuals should live their life as they choose, as long as they don't violate the rights of others, and believe that that we should respect the choices of others, and as I said in the intro, we should not have government that tells people what books they can read, who they can love, and what they can do in their own personal lives and how they make their own personal choices. So that kind of summarizes the direction that I moved in since, and I'll be talking a lot more about this in other videos, but basically, as you'll see from the content of this channel, I've definitely moved away from that past, and this is what's currently on my Facebook page, and I've definitely moved more to the left. In the 2024 election, I did vote for Kamala Harris, and I would cast that vote again. If casting past votes, I certainly would vote for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. I would vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016 if I had that vote to do it all over again. I would vote for Al Gore in 2000 when I look back and realize what kind of president is a George W. Bush led, and a lot of what happened, including the Gulf War that I was against at the time in both 1991, even though I was on the right, I was still against that back then. I was against the so-called global war on terror and a lot of what George W. Bush did. And I think we would have been much better off had we elected Al Gore in 2000 instead of George W. Bush. So anyway, I'll be discussing a lot more of these issues in other videos on this channel. I just wanted to give that bit of background of how I used to be a right-winger. Now I'm definitely on the left. I would describe myself as a populist, progressive, socially liberal, and economically populist, and very much in favor of moving forward with a more progressive policy, and definitely not regressive, retrograde, reactionary, right-wing, ultra-conservative policies that we see coming from MAGA Republicans. Thank you for watching, and I hope this channel helps you in thinking about a crazy political world and living your best life. Please do the YouTube stuff and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos.